What's up, everybody? It's Izzy, and in this video I'm going to give you some wide stance deadlift considerations, and we're going to break it up into three parts: the wide stance deadlift, the medium wide stance deadlift, and the narrow wide stance deadlift. So here's the thing: what I'm going to do in this video is I'm basically going to pretend that the sumo deadlift, when viewed from the front, is a 2D statics problem in terms of physics, which every real physicist and person who studied biomechanics knows that it is not. However, for the purposes of this video, we're going to oversimplify things in terms of the moment arms and the torques at the various joints, just to help you guys get an understanding of what I'm talking about. But again, please keep in mind that it's not necessarily 100% accurate to consider any of the lifts from a 2D statics perspective. So let's start off with the narrow sumo deadlift here. All right, so as I said, the first deadlift that we're going to look at is the narrow sumo. Some people call this the modified sumo. It's really the Ed Coan sumo because he's the one that popularized it. Now, in my opinion, this one is really not that different from a conventional deadlift, and you will not see that many people using it because it tends to give you the disadvantages of both types of deadlifts. That is to say, it features the long range of motion of a conventional deadlift while also featuring the somewhat inefficient start position of the sumo. As you can see, you've created all these moment arms that wouldn't necessarily be there in a conventional deadlift, right? In a proper conventional deadlift, for the most part, the hips, knees, and ankles are all in a straight line, which minimizes the moment, at least that we're looking at, from this frontal plane. So with this narrow sumo, you get this moment arm along the shank because the ankle is inside of the knee. And overall, again, like I said, it's basically just a conventional deadlift with an inefficient start position. But for some people, it can work because it allows them to add the hips into the movement. It trades just a little bit of back for a little bit more hips. And for some people's body types and musculature, it can be a net win over the conventional deadlift. However, this is not a place that I would recommend that you start if you're trying to learn the sumo deadlift. Instead, I'd recommend that you start at the next position, which is the moderate sumo. Let's take a look at that. All right, you'll see me widen out here to what I'm going to call the moderate sumo deadlift, the moderate wide stance deadlift. And the key factor here that you're going to see is that my knees are stacked right on top of my ankles. That is the denominating factor, the delineating factor, whatever, I'm messing up the words, but you get it. And let's take a look at the picture here and see why. By stacking the knee right on top of the ankle, we eliminate the moment arm along the shank. While it is true that we elongate the moment arm between, the knee and the hip, and thus further increase the demands of the hips in the moderate stance sumo deadlift, both, the external rotators of the hips and the hip musculature in general, this tends to be a place where we start to see the benefits of sumo rather than just the negatives. Because it is true that the starting position is somewhat inefficient, but you can get very good leg drive here because actually, compared to a conventional deadlift or a narrow stance sumo, you'll notice that the knee angle is notably more closed. And with a notably more closed knee angle, that gives you the opportunity to get a lot of drive from the legs, more contribution from the legs. And because the ankle is right under the knee, that contribution is fairly efficient compared to when the ankle is inside of the knee or outside of the knee. Now, a moderate sumo has a bunch of different considerations. First, the moderate sumo width itself is actually going to be determined by how tall you are in combination with your mobility. Let's excuse the passing train. How lovely is that? But yes, this is one huge difference in the sumo deadlift versus the conventional deadlift, is that mobility actually matters. And I'm not necessarily saying it's something that you can improve to any great degree by working on it. You can get a little bit better and you can widen your stance out over time, but people who are naturally gifted in terms of being able to open at the hips are going to be able to use a relatively wider moderate stance where they still have that knee right on top of the ankle. And again, this is what you're going for over time if you want to use a sumo deadlift. The reason for it is, of course, with that knee right on top of the ankle, you have that efficient force transfer off of the ground, so you're getting a lot of contribution from the legs. And at the same time, the wider that you stand, the less the range of motion is going to be. So start here, wherever that is for you. Try to improve your mobility over time and get slightly wider. But if you're new to sumo, this is the place that I'd begin your experimentation from. And I would not begin your experimentation from the stance that we're going to look at next, which is the wide sumo. As you see, I'm going to set up here for an ultra wide sumo. And the reason why I say ultra wide is because this is a deadlift bar. So if you're an IPF competitor or you use a standard bar, you're not even going to be able to put your legs as wide as I am here because it doesn't have that much space. This bar is longer than normal. But anyway, the key point here with the wide stance sumo deadlift, how we're noting it or how we're differentiating it from the other types is that the ankle was going to be outside the knee. So you can clearly see that here, that I have actually reintroduced a moment arm along the shank. And you can see that because there's distance between that ankle and that knee, right? And this really decreases the efficiency of the force transfer between, the foot all the way through the knee to the hip, right? It's just a less efficient position because of that created added moment arm along the shank. Now, does that mean necessarily 100% that you are going to lift less weight because of this inefficiency? No. It's just like a wide grip bench press. Sometimes the created or the added inefficiencies of the wider grip or the wider stance don't matter because the range of motion is cut down significantly enough that you still lift more weight. However, I would consider this a more advanced stance width than the moderate, and I would really only try this out after you've gotten a good handle on the moderate sumo and you can perform that technically correctly, because again, this one does have higher demands in terms of mobility, in terms of just even being able to get into the position without pain or discomfort or feeling super weird. And in my opinion, this is why a lot of people dismiss the sumo deadlift as weaker and will always be weaker than their conventional deadlift, is because they tried to get into this position from the very beginning. That's just the extreme. You don't necessarily need to start from this position, and in fact, I wouldn't recommend it. It's something that you can experiment with over time because, again, maybe the added range of motion benefit, the range of motion that you lose by standing just a little bit wider is worth the less efficient leg drive in the long run, but that's something that's going to be very individual. And in fact, I see for most people, especially raw lifters that don't lift equipped, that the added range of motion that's cut off, or the cutoff range of motion, is not worth the inefficiency off of the floor. But again, I would recommend that you go with the moderate sumo and try this over time, because there's no guarantee that just because the moderate sumo stance is more efficient off the floor, that the wide stance isn't going to be better for you. All right, to recap, we've got the 3 different types of sumo deadlifts here: the narrow sumo, the wide sumo, and the moderate sumo. And again, the narrow sumo to me is more like a conventional deadlift than it is the more traditional sumo types, the more traditional wide and moderate styles, because you're really not going to end up in a very vertical position there. It's still going to use a lot of back. The range of motion is still really long. And it's not something that, in my experience, a lot of lifters use at the highest levels. There are some here and there, so don't get me wrong. I'm not saying to completely rule it out, but most of the time, people don't use that one. Now, the one that almost everybody tries is the ultra-wide sumo to cut off as much range of motion as possible, where you immediately start with your toes to the plates. And I think this is a mistake because, again, this requires immense mobility for most people. It's a very uncomfortable position for most people if they haven't trained any other type of sumo before. And there is some inefficiency inherent in the setup that makes your drive off of the ground much weaker than with a moderate sumo stance. So again, I highly recommend that if you're new to sumo or you're not really technically proficient in the lift yet, that you should start out with a stance where you can get your knees directly above your ankles, and that stance width is going to be determined by how tall you are and how mobile you are. The more mobile you are, the wider that stance is going to be and still be considered moderate with your knees over your ankles. And the same goes for if you're tall. If you're tall, you're going to be able to take a wider stance while still remaining moderate. Anyways, guys, I hope you found that video informative or useful. If you have any other topics you'd like me to discuss, I will do my best to get around to them. And as always, my friends, have a great day. Good luck with your training, and peace.